Hey everybody, it's Ed. Real quick, I want to thank 3 brand new podcast supporters, Dennis Miller, Mark Humphreys, and Mary Lamy. These folks signed up to support the podcast financially, and if you want to learn more how that works, you can go to mountainandprairie.com/support. But thanks to these 3 folks and to the very, very long list of people who have supported the podcast over the years, it really, really makes a difference. And I've got some exciting things planned for 2021 that's a direct result of that financial support. So I really appreciate it. Hope you all have a happy new year. Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is Monte Burke. Monte is a journalist, New York Times bestselling author, and contributing editor at Forbes, Garden & Gun, and The Drake. His most recent book is Lords of the Fly, Madness, Obsession, and the Hunt for the World-Record Tarpon, which was one of the best books that I read in 2020. He's also the author of Saban, The Making of a Coach, which also happens to be one of my all-time favorite books. Whether he's writing about fly fishing, Colorado conservationists, elk hunting, or football, Monte's work is always impeccably researched and fun to read. I loved every page of Lords of the Fly, and both anglers and non-anglers alike will be drawn into the book's engaging story and wild characters. One of my favorite aspects of the book was how it opened my eyes to the connections between the 1970s Florida fishing scene and modern-day art, poetry, and literature of the American West. Western luminaries who are frequently mentioned on this podcast, people like Tom McGuane, Jim Harrison, Richard Brautigan, Russell Chatham, and more, all created art and chased tarpon together in Florida in the 1970s. They all eventually moved west and became some of the most respected Western artists of their time. But were it not for the creative foundation they built in Florida, today's Western literary and art scene would look quite different. Monte and I had a fun and wide-ranging conversation discussing everything from fly fishing to fatherhood. We started out talking about Lords of the Fly. We obviously discussed the crew of anglers that included McGuane and Harrison, but we also talked about the full cast of obsessed characters who make up the history of fly fishing for tarpon. Monte explains why this story was so compelling to him, and he discusses some of the headwinds that he encountered while trying to get the book published. We talked about Monte's attraction to writing about intense, obsessed people, whether they happen to be world champion coaches or world champion anglers. We chatted about Monte's writing and journalism career, as well as some of the routines that have allowed him to be such a prolific writer. And as usual, we discuss favorite books, authors, films, and he offers up some wise parting words. If you love fishing and literature, or if you're an aspiring writer or artist, this episode is chock full of useful information. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to everything we discuss. This episode very well may hold the record for the most books and authors recommended. Hope you enjoy. You've written about so many different things, so many different subjects. What was it about tarpon fishing that sucked you in and you were like, all right, there's a book here. I'm willing to devote years to write this in a book format. What was it about this story that drew you in?
Well, it's interesting because I've been told by agents and editors and publishers, stuff like that, and even told by a little voice in my head that, leave the fishing stuff behind, or at least put it to the side and do, quote unquote, more serious stuff. Yeah. Do more business books or do, more books about football coaches and stuff like that. So it's always kind of in the back of my head. But, with this story, I felt like I had to get it out of it. It was clogging the system. Mm-hmm. Like I had to get it out in order to do, other projects. And, I think it came kind of just initially from the awe that I feel every time I hook a tarpon or go tarpon fishing, and the sort of different, not only awe, but also the fear and the excitement and pain and all that kind of shit that goes through your head when you're out there tarpon fishing. And so, the sort of species got me. And then growing up a geek of fly fishing literature, not all of which is literature actually, but, reading a bunch of fly fishing stuff and reading about, big names in fly fishing, Flip Hallett, and Chico Fernandez, and Stu Apt, and the baseball player Ted Williams, and Billy Pate. All these names have been kind of swimming around in my head. And when I realized that all of these guys were connected in some way, shape, or form to this story about, Homosassa, the centerpiece of the book, Homosassa in the late 70s and early 80s, this sort of apex moment in the sport of fly fishing. And kind of once I realized that all of these sort of dudes were all connected and that they hadn't really been written about, I didn't think anyway, in a kind of objective and serious way. There was a lot of deification in fly fishing writing, it seems like to me. So, it became a story that I had to tell. I mean, and again, not only that nagging voice in the back of my head. I mean, I just come off the Saban book, which was a success, and everyone was like, okay, who's your next coach? Are we gonna do Steve Kerr? What are we gonna do? There's all kinds of, because coaches are just unendingly fascinating to me. Mm-hmm. But because these guys are getting older, and the story kind of needed to be told. This Lords of the Fly story. And like I said, it was kind of clogging up the system. I had a lot I wanted to say about fishing. I love it. And so I just decided to do it. And, kind of against the wishes of agents and editors and all that kind of stuff too. But, I think sometimes when something is just bubbling up within you, you just have to go with it. And it was such a pleasure. My wife thought I was crazy. It was like kind of the beginning of the pandemic and even a little bit before then. I was kind of in the stages where I had the book all done pretty much, but I was going through and rereading it. And, my favorite part of the whole process, which is when you're just adding little touches here and there. And I was so excited to work on this thing, to read it again. I would get up at 4:30, sometimes 3:30, wake up at 3:30 in the morning, 4:30 in the morning, and just go get a cup of coffee and go sit down and just read. And it was just I was just so that pumped up about it and that energized by it. And man, it's hard to find things like that in your life. And if you do, jump on them, So there'll be time, I guess, for coaches and all that kind of other stuff. But so that was sort of the impetus. It was sort of a story that I felt like I had to tell.
No, man, I absolutely loved it. I mean, I read a lot of books and I get a lot of books sent my way, which is awesome. But I've got a surprisingly short attention span. But I picked up this book like the day it arrived, and I think I was done with it within 72 hours. I mean, I just absolutely loved it. And like we had talked about before, I was a big fan of your book about Saban. And so I want to kind of talk about all that. But when was the point? I mean, you were obviously kind of immersed in this fishing world and saw the connections. I mean, was there like a single point when it kind of came together, like, oh wow, all these guys are connected, there's an opportunity here? Or was it kind of a slow build over many years and then finally it was one day just like a breaking point? You're like, all right, I got to write this thing.
Yeah. I mean, it was like, I guess it's like going bankrupt. It happened slowly at first and then all at once, right? So I was lucky enough for Garden Gun, which is a magazine I write for quite a bit and I just love, sent me to go do a story on the fishing guide Steve Huff, who they called in the story the greatest fishing guide alive. I would not disagree with that title. I fully agree with it. So they sent me to go do a story on Steve Huff, who's the shallow water fishing guide who had been in the Keys for a long time and since he'd been in the Everglades since then. And, he countless world records, all these people that he guided. I mean, it was just all these boats he had made. He was such a huge figure in sort of the saltwater fly fishing scene. Did that story on him, and then actually got an assignment to do a story on Carl Hyacin. And Hyacin said, "I will do this story, but on one condition: we have to go fishing with Steve Huff." He was a client of Steve's, so I was like, "Okay." So this was 6 months later after I did the Steve Huff story. So I got to know Steve pretty well, was lucky enough to become one of Steve's clients. He only has 10 or 12. And so, we fished together for year after year after year. And we would, as you do when you're 3 or 4 days on a boat with someone, you just, just talk about everything. I mean, it's interesting how fly fishing guides could write really interesting stories. I think about some of the things that the clients tell them. They discuss their whole life, whatever. But Steve would always mention the word homosassa, which I just and he says it in his wonderful kind of Southern Florida accent. It just sounded poetic. It sounded enchanting to me. And then he started telling me about the stories about, again, this kind of apex moment in fly fishing. And so I was getting intrigued. And then he told me about Tom Evans, who seemed like who was a person that he had guided at first in homosassa and broken some records with. And then they parted, in a rather odd, strange way. I think Steve called him the most selfish prick he'd ever met. So he told me about Tom Evans, who seemed like a really interesting character. Didn't seem like Mr. Rogers, but he seemed like a really interesting guy. And then a couple years after that, I did another story. I went down and fished with Andy Mill and his son Nicky in the Keys, and Andy's just a font of tarpon knowledge. He was a former U.S. ski team member who became arguably the greatest tournament tarpon fisherman ever. And he's just really into the sport. And he started telling me a little bit about homosassa and Tom Evans. And then he said, and then I think it was like in early 2018 or late 2017, Andy called me and said, look, you just have to do this. You have to do a book on this time. It was just this magical, awesome time. You have to do a book on it. And I still wasn't really sold. But they said, here, I'm going to give you Tom Evans' phone number. Call him and just chat with him or whatever. So I called Tom Evans, and he lives in Grafton, Vermont, which is not too far away from my place here in Brooklyn. So I just got in the car and drove 4.5 hours up and, sat down with Tom Evans for an entire day and then an entire half a day. And, at that point I was like, holy crap, because, then it all came together about where this kind of fit in the fly fishing world or in the fishing world in general. It had a lot to do with obsession, which is my favorite thing to write about. Just people doing crazy, wacky things in the pursuit, in pursuits that to other people don't mean a damn thing. And it connected all these names. And so, I was like, this is a book now. To me, anyway, it seemed like a book. It seemed like they were the beginnings of this whole interconnected tale. I had no idea about some interesting characters in there, like Bobby Era, the gangster, and there were other folks that kind of popped in as I did reporting. But at that point, I knew it was a narrative, and I also at that point knew it was something I really wanted to tell. And again, this was done against some pretty serious headwinds. I mean, I had a couple editors who I just loved working with on different books, books I'd done before, who said, fishing book, man. We're not. Come talk to me when you got your next idea, stuff like that. But that's the way it goes. I have to say that I've gotten emails from a couple of those editors who now wish that they'd been involved in it. And my agent, too, was a little skeptical at first, but then he was like, dude, I'll do whatever you want to do. I'll make it happen. And he's ecstatic. So, it all worked out. But, again, it was just like something that it sounds selfish, and it is kind of selfish, but it's just something I felt like I had to do. I just had to do it.
Now, I've heard that a lot from authors over the years, that they know that it's time to write when they've got a book inside of them, that they have to get it out. Like they have no choice but to get it out. And I've heard that many times, and I love hearing it. One thing that really connected with me in the book kind of early on was your discussions about Key West early on with guys like McGuane and Harrison, because obviously those guys are fixtures in the American West, which is what this podcast is about. But as I was reading that, I was thinking, if it weren't for that time in Florida together, who knows if they ever would have even come out this way, and they likely wouldn't have been the pair that they were, and their work would have been influenced differently. And, on this podcast, their names come up over and over and over as influences. And I just thought that was so interesting about how they really, the foundation of everything they did was built there in the Keys. Could you just kind of give an overview? I mean, don't spoil anything, but an overview of those guys and their contribution to tarpon fishing and how it kind of influenced their work and their lives from starting out in the 70s and going on for decades.
I mean, that was one of my favorite because I am just a McGuane. I just adore McGuane, both his novels and his nonfiction. I adore Jim Harrison. I've always loved Russell Chatham's paintings. I read Trout Fishing in America by the poet Richard Brautigan. I'm not so sure I understood it, but I always appreciated sort of his place in the sort of pantheon. And so, what was cool about this time in Key West was, a little earlier, guys like Flip Pallett and Chico Fernandez had made tarpon fishing finally accessible. They kind of figured out the right rods to use, the right, reels, the right lines, the right hooks to actually, land one of these monstrous fish. What happened after that, the camera kind of panned down from Miami, where those guys were, to Key West, where you all of a sudden had this group of young, up-and-coming artists, McGuane, a writer, Harrison, a writer, Chatham, a painter, early on in his career at that point, Brautigan, a poet, Guy Valdine, a kind of underrated writer, doesn't write all that much, but what he writes is really good. Jimmy Buffett was there for a little while. Hunter S. Thompson stormed in and out. He didn't fish much, but what was cool about it is I called them the merry pranksters of the tarpon world. So they all gravitated to this spot because of the tarpon and because of what it became this sort of artistic expression. They were expressing their art through the pursuit of these tarpon. They were trying to do what all art does, really, which is to describe the indescribable. They had a great time off the water. I mean, they partied it up. There were lots of women involved. There were a good amount of drugs involved.
Yeah. But
they were always true. They never missed a clement day. If it was a tarpon day, they were out there. And so it was just this really cool thing that they did every year. They met every year. They attracted a bunch of other, people in there. And again, they were sort of expressing their art. And it's actually from that period that Richard Brautigan, the poet, who would a number of years later put a Smith & Wesson in his face and kill himself. But at that point, he was still sort of, with it a little bit. But he described, he hooked his first tarpon, and he described the experience as immediate unreality, which I've always loved. It's the best way to describe hooking a tarpon, which again is the sort of indescribable, it's what attracted those guys. So, out of that period, what you get is, you got Harrison at that point was not even published. He had published a little thing of poetry, but, he sort of always used fishing in some of his stories, stuff like that, but he always used it really as a respite from his rather rugged life. I mean, he not only worked really hard, he smoked hard, he drank hard, he did everything really hard. So fishing became kind of his little pressure valve releaser. McGuane, of course, has written, I would argue the greatest, fishing literature ever written.
Yeah.
And what was cool about him is that he took that, what I've always loved about McGuane is that he took writing about fishing as seriously as he took his novels. And that really opens up everything for, the reader, who can take it just as seriously as reading a novel, which is really awesome. But also, like, if you're an aspiring writer, I think I say in there that we're all sort of just pale disciples of McGuane, really, but it allows you to kind of do the same thing. So in essence, in a weird way, McGuane allowed me to do this book, right? I mean, I can do a serious journalism book on Nick Saban, but I treated this one just as seriously as it did that. I mean, not, just because it's fishing doesn't matter. And then, you got McGuane kind of coming out of this writing novels and, very, very much influenced by that time there. Russell Chatham, incredibly influenced, I think. I mean, his landscape paintings are of the American West, but, that sort of vivid vastness that you find in Key West, you can see that in a lot of his paintings. Brautigan didn't live much longer after that, and kind of went into a spiral of alcoholism. So not much came out of him. But Buffett too. Obviously, Buffett sort of became the emblematic Key West guy. So I loved that chapter. It gave me an excuse to. I mean, I'd met Tom McGuane a couple times, but it gave me an excuse to actually go out and just spend some real quality time with him, which was it's like. It's like someone who plays basketball beating Michael Jordan. Like, to me anyway, it was just unbelievable.
McGuane, he just seems like such an interesting guy. And I to be honest, I had not read much of his stuff up until a few years ago. And I heard a podcast interview with him and Steven Ranella, the guy who does Meat Eater. And it's probably the best podcast I've ever heard. And McGuane just seems like he's such an independent thinker. Like he's doing his own thing, but he's respectful of, he's not a rancher, but he's in the middle of the ranching world and he's respectful of those guys. And he has earned their respect. And, same, I guess, down in Key West. Thinking about, more about McGuane. I mean, like when you look at him as a writer, I mean, this may be a hard question to answer, but like, why is he so good at what he does? I mean, what is it that makes him so unique? Because your book encouraged me to pick up 92 in the Shade because I was so curious about how crazy all those guys were in Key West. I wanted to understand more about it. And his writing is just so unique, but I'm having a hard time pinning it down. Like, why is this so good? Like, what is so good about this?
So his novels, he's always struck me as someone a little bit like Richard Ford. I mean, he's just got this great conversational, just his voice alone is the setting, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I mean, so many of his great short stories are in particular are set out West, and you kind of know it's going to be out West, but there's something about the voice, not only his voice as a writer, but also the voice of his characters, which I know exactly where I am in Montana, and I know where it's at a train depot in Billings somewhere. It just has this incredible, Richard Ford does that incredibly well too. And then, when you go to his nonfiction, it's just hard to explain exactly what it is, but there's this sort of, it's not an arm's length voice, but it's a voice that it's not omniscient, but there's something there that's super powerful and super in command of this thing's handled so well that you're just going to go along with it for the ride and just enjoy the beauty of the sentences and everything like that. I mean, excuse me, every year before I go tarpon fishing or I sit down and reread, I've got The Longest Silence up here. I'll pick and choose and read stories that I've literally read probably 20 or 30 times, but I'll just read them again. They're like old friends. And, his voice, when it comes to nonfiction, to me, is just the best one that's ever, it's just unbelievable. I mean, you wish that you could, and, to me, it's even better than people like Michael Lewis, stuff like that. I mean, it's not really repertoire. He's not really a reporter, but it's just about the narrative. You jump in on the journey and you're just ready to go. If that makes any sense.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. And I've gotten obsessed with both him and Jim Harrison. And it's because of this podcast, and people just continue to mention it over and over. And I'm still in that phase with both of them where I'm just kind of amazed. And I just don't understand how a human is capable of coming up with stuff like that. Another question about your book. One of the things I really liked about it was how you brought yourself into the story a little bit, and you talked about the reasons you love fishing. There was a cool part at the beginning, I remember, where you were talking about how fishing is a thing that allows you to kind of clear out your mind. When you get a fish on, it's just, you're completely zoned in, and you're able to share some of your story. And it's almost like you're a part of it without being a blatant part of it. And I love that. And I thought it made it so much richer, and it made me feel like I knew you. But what was the decision process on that versus just writing a straight up history? Like if somebody's writing a biography or something, you don't even know the author's there. They're just presenting it. What was your thought on that?
It's such an interesting question because it's something you got to decide sort of, as you do it, obviously. And I've always been jealous of people who can kind of wind their personal narratives into a different narrative. I mean, Wright Thompson just did that with Pappyland, writing about the Pappy Van Winkle books. I mean, it's as much a book about, if not more, about Wright Thompson than it is about, Pappy Van Winkle. But so I actually have never really been comfortable with that. I when I was at Forbes, when I was at other places, when writing my other books, I don't think the word the word I did not show up in the Saban book. It showed up just a touch in one book I did many years ago, just in kind of the introduction. So it's a little bit odd, and I didn't, you don't want to overpower it, I don't think, but there were just times when I was there, so I kind of had to insert myself. There was also a lot that I wanted to say about fishing. I mean, there's a lot of things that I've thought about quite a bit. I kind of want, this was an excuse. I may never do another fishing book, so this was kind of an excuse to sort of, get those things out. But I think it's a really delicate balance. I think if you screw that up and there's too much of you in there and it's not interesting or anything like that, then man, you've just shit the bed.
Yeah.
So I think you got to like figure out whether, you just got to figure out whether it's working or not and just sprinkle it in. And I tried not to be, I think I did it a little bit in the beginning and then I disappear for a long, long time. And then come back at the end when it's sort of back in the present a little bit, back with, Tom Evans and what probably is his last trip, down to Homosassa. I had to kind of, because I was, just there, I guess I became a little bit of a character, but I'm glad you thought it worked because it's always, I don't know, it always felt weird. It's always felt weird for me to put myself into any story other than just being kind of a narrator. Sometimes you write like just a narrator-based story about fishing for false albacore or something like that, or trout fishing. But just to report a story and then insert yourself in is not something I'm always all that comfortable with.
No, I thought it was perfect. I thought it made the book, even more of a rich story because you're obviously so invested in it, and you obviously care about this story, but you care about the sport. And you're really the perfect person to tell that story. And so I absolutely loved it. To kind of to back out a little bit just on your career, at least in writing books, what is it that attracts you to people that are just obsessed? Because, between this book, which is just one story after another of people that are almost insanely obsessed with this pursuit of a fish. And then Saban, who, but thanks to your book, when I think of somebody who's the most intense person in the world and who would just, they are focused on their job above all else, Saban's one of maybe the top three that come to mind because of reading your book. So when did you become so enamored with obsessed people? Because I'm the same way.
I think I probably always have been a little bit. I think a lot of us are, if not all of us are to a certain degree. But first of all, they make incredible profiles. I mean, there's like when I was at Forbes and, it could be a relatively boring story. It could be like or what might seem like a boring story, like the CEO of like a supermarket chain or whatever. But if that person was like totally into it, like it was actually could be kind of fun, right? It's a little harder than the constraints of a business magazine to really go deep on that kind of stuff. But I think obsessions to me are just so interesting. Like I said before, like, if I were to walk around Brooklyn and be like, I'm obsessed with catching the world record tarpon, people would look at me cross-eyed and be like, dude, what the fuck are you talking about? What is a tarpon? What do you mean a world record? All that kind of stuff too. So, it's interesting to me that like but all of us are kind of obsessed with something, and probably to other people, what we're obsessed about doesn't mean very much to them. And in fact, I think Susan Orlean wrote really well about obsession in The Orchid Thief. She wrote about this guy who was obsessed with very rare orchids and how obsessions can, as you get older, they kind of seem naive and childish and sort of silly. But, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is, if you take all of these little niche-y obsessions and, take them all together, they're what makes the world turn.
Uh-huh.
It's like what made, it's like what I was talking about earlier about getting up at 4:30 to go read, this silly book about tarpon. Like, I was obsessed with it, right? And it like animated my life. Like, it got me out of bed every day. It animated my life. And you just, whether it's, finding a rare orchid or catching the biggest tarpon or collecting, butterflies or whatever it is, like, it's like, if you take all of these obsessions together, it's like, that's kind of what animates the world, right? It's like what keeps people, otherwise life can be a little mundane. Of course, there's a real downside to, and this is always interesting about obsession too, there's a dark side to it too. If you take it too far, which I've written about a lot of people who've taken it too far, it can become like literally deadly. I mean, you can, not only lose your marriage or have your kids never talk to you again, but like you can die if you take it too far.
Yep.
Sylvia Plath said, I'm going to murder her great quote, but she said basically something like, I want the things that'll kill me in the end. And that always has like struck me as like, a lot of these obsessed characters, they don't know when to pull back. They don't know when to pull back, and they go too far. I mean, there are a couple guys in the Tarpon book who literally die, in large part because of their obsession, not only with tarpon, but with drugs and all kinds of stuff too. So I don't know. I just find, I found Saban to be just unbelievable because how could you be like that? How could you be so laser focused and so obsessed with one thing? Same thing with these tarpon guys. Like how could it be that, Tom Evans would go spend a month there, the month of May, fishing for tarpon, and a lot of times not catching anything, but then he'd spend the other 11 months of the year thinking about it and planning for it, preparing for it, and tying knots, and I don't know. So I love the cool aspect of obsessions. The detrimental part of obsessions is interesting to me, very interesting to me. So, that's kind of a long answer, but that I don't know. It animates me to think about people who are obsessed and write about them.
Oh no, I agree completely. And there's this documentary called Valley Uprising, and it's about the history of climbing in Yosemite Valley. And I'm going to have one of the guys that's in the film on the podcast soon. And, as I was reading your book, I was thinking, you can find any niche, whether it's something that seems, as non-threatening as collecting orchids to, wingsuit jumping off of cliffs in Yosemite, right, to surfing to, I just finished up the Michael Jordan documentary the other day, and just no matter where you go, you can find these little subsets of people that are just insanely obsessed. What are you obsessed with anything? Do you get obsessed with anything other than, obviously writing, but are there, because I would think you'd have to be at the level you are, but what else gets you obsessed? I
go through phases when I become completely obsessed with fly fishing. I'm now nearing this sort of, I'm going to go out. Christmas Eve is usually my traditional end. I've missed it a couple of years, but for the last 20 years or so, I've fished for striped bass up here over here in New York on Christmas Eve. But so there are times during the fly fishing season when I become like completely obsessed with whatever type I'm doing, if it's false albacore or trout or tarpon or whatever. What's important to me though is that I have an off season. My off season is pretty much going to start like Christmas Day. I don't think I'm going to go to the Bahamas this year or travel anywhere, so I probably won't fish again until March. It actually is a kind of a good thing in some ways. It's like, I don't know if you're a football fan, but like what makes football, one of the things that makes football so damn cool is that it has its seasons and it has its rituals, and it has the leaves getting dry and rattling in the trees, and it's kind of football season. And I feel like that's a lot of people, the big thing now is to fish all year round if you can, like go in the snow and go nymph for trout, somewhere. But I think it's a good thing to kind of take a little time off. So yeah, I become obsessed with writing for sure. I become obsessed with fly fishing for sure. I become obsessed with reading. I was obsessed. I was a soccer coach for many years. I became totally obsessed with that. So yeah, I can jump around and get pretty into things. I don't think it ever reached the Nick Saban level, the Stu Apt level, and that might be a good thing. I'm not sure, but
no, I think that if you want to have a family and be somewhat normal, but I think for me it snaps me out of kind of funks or if I'm feeling kind of sloppy or whatever. If I can get honed in on a specific goal or obsession, for me nowadays it's running. And I've actually, all over the weekend, I was getting all fired up to sign up for a long race this early summer because I was feeling kind of sloppy and like not eating right and all that. And I was like, all right, if I can get obsessed with something, everything will fall in the line. But then there's the downside of my family having to deal with me when I'm doing that,
right. But that's I think you made the good point there. It gives you a focus, right? It's a focal point through which everything else can kind of be filtered. And again, you don't want to take it too far if you've got kids or a wife or even good friends who kind of rely on you. You don't want to become a crazy person, but I think it's just great. I think all of us are like that in some ways, shape, or form. We go through these things. If you're lucky enough to put food on the table and have a decent income, then you can get obsessed about things like that seem inconsequential a little bit, right? And it's okay. It's like that's life. That's what gives life animation.
Oh yeah, I heard Yvon Chouinard from Patagonia one time. He referred to mountain climbers or he was quoting somebody who had referred to mountain climbers as conquistadors of the useless. And I thought that was perfect because that's kind of what everything we do really is that if you're in a privileged enough spot to run 100 miles or go to the Bahamas chasing fish. But you kind of have to inject that stuff into your life or else it's too easy, I think.
Too easy, but also boring as shit, right? Imagine how boring life would be without the without the things you get obsessed about. And by the way, probably my greatest obsession is with my kids, and with my wife. Like, it's with my you don't look at that in terms of obsession, but in terms of, what drives you and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's very much like, how the kids doing, school going okay. It's like, you just like, that is probably the biggest obsession that many of us have, that we don't categorize as obsession, but it is.
So speaking of that, when you had your kids, how did that change your approach to writing or your approach to your career? I mean, did it kind of focus things in a lot? Because, I mean, for me personally, and feel free to disagree if you had a different experience, but when my first daughter was born, I felt like pretty quickly, like, the blinders came on and a lot of the bullshit went aside, and I really was able to focus in more, because at that point it wasn't for me, it was for somebody else. Did it affect your writing or your journalism career? I mean, or I should say, how did it affect your journalism career?
Yeah. So how many kids do you have?
2 girls, 5 or almost 6 and 2. So they're crazy.
I've got 3 girls, 16, 14, and 18. Or
Nice.
And 8, sorry. And so, yeah, I mean, it definitely gives you, I would say, like, the first month or so, like, I was just so tired with each kid. I was tired. I couldn't do a damn thing. But yeah, I mean, it gives a certain gravitas to everything. You're not just screwing around anymore, like, in your 20s, messing around, having fun. Like, it does all mean something. It also gave, I became much more efficient because you want, you kind of have to be, right? Because if you don't, it's not like you can just, at 7 o'clock, just, start writing or something like that. Like, you've got dinner and stuff, it's like, so it just makes you more efficient. And then, I don't know, it's been really cool to, like, now they're old enough now where they kind of, like, watch, you can see them, and they watch my wife, and my wife she's a television producer, and they sort of, you can see them kind of being curious about what it is. What do my parents do? My dad's a weird dude. Like, he's here all day, he's in the back, talking to people and jamming on his keyboard, stuff like that. So it's kind of cool now where they kind of look at, maybe they're looking at you as a source of, like, like, that's what work looks like or whatever. I have to say, though, during the pandemic has been not the most productive time of my life. I mean, I'm used to having a house. Me and the dog have the house, from 8 o'clock till 4 o'clock, like, no one here. Yeah. That has not been the case since March. So, but yeah, I mean, I think totally, I mean, having kids is like this crazy, it matured me very quickly, all of a sudden I was like, holy shit. But you don't, so you become more serious in one way. I think you also kind of remain like a kid in a lot of ways, because you do fun things that you used to do when you were a kid again. It's kind of fun to, like, relive your childhood with an ache in your back and bulky knees, but still, like, it's kind of fun.
Oh yeah, definitely. I feel like you're seeing everything for the second time. It's almost like it's your first time seeing things through these new eyes, because you're having to teach these little people about things. And for me, like, with all the outdoor stuff, it forces me to really know what I'm talking about, because my oldest is always asking me all these questions, and I can't make up stuff, and she's already smarter than I am. So it's it's a cool experience.
I feel like you need to know about a lot of stuff. Like, when they ask you, like, Dad, when they say defund the police, like, what does that mean? And, like, I have to know what the hell that, what it means, right? Or when they ask about what Black Lives Matter or whatever is going on right now, or the presidential race, whatever. Like, it's like I feel like I got to be pretty knowledgeable about all that stuff in order just not to be filling their heads with bullshit. I do have to say that I never realized how much parenting is just sort of like, an immediate decision kind of off your back foot. Like,
oh yeah.
I thought my parents really had it together. They thought through everything. But you realize how many decisions are made sort of like, quickly, without a whole lot of thought, on the run type of decisions.
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about that a lot recently because I was looking at some old pictures, and I was, I've looked at them of when I was a kid, and I'm like, I'm older than my parents were in that picture. Yeah. And I felt like they knew what they were doing, and they're so smart, and they had it all figured out. And I don't know what the hell I'm doing.
I don't either. I mean, it's so un-black and white. It's like there's so much gray. And, I don't know. My wife and I always talk about what the end goal is. It would just, like, to me, it's like, I guess it's self-confidence. That would be the one thing. If I could choose one thing to kind of instill within them, it would just be self-confidence. I mean, you can't do much. You can do something about grades, but not all that much, and like you do some things about the social life, but not all that much. Right. But I think you can instill self-confidence.
I agree 100%. We just had that conversation the other day, and that is the goal. And I don't know how to do it. If you figure it out, let me know. If you could figure it out, write a book about it, you'd be a billionaire. So I want to hear about your personal story. I looked through some of your old articles and got a bit of I feel like I was able to put some stuff together, but I'm just curious, when did writing and reading and writing, and when did that become the center point of your life? And when did you decide, all right, that's what I want to do when I grow up?
I mean, I always loved reading. I actually remember, Dr. Hannum was my English teacher. I think in 11th grade, we read Great Gatsby, and the way he taught, he was this really cool Virginia gentleman who always dressed really dapper and had this cool voice. He was just a cool dude. One of those teachers that is cool. And he used to teach Gatsby, and it just kind of just blew my mind. Not only the book, but the way it was taught, all that kind of stuff too. So I knew kind of in high school that I loved that reading was always a big part of my life. It became a bigger part of my life then. And then in college, I wanted to be a writer. I don't think I had the balls to be like, I want to be a writer. I mean, to me, it's a big declaration of a big declaration you make publicly and you can fail at pretty easily, right?
Sure.
And also a big declaration I'm an artist. No one likes the pretentious dude walking around saying I'm the artist. So I was a little reluctant to kind of just come out and say it. And I'm the oldest of three boys, and I always felt like I needed to be responsible. And my dad died when I was pretty young, so I was like, I need to show the way for my younger brothers and how to be a responsible adult. So I applied to business school out of college, and I got in to a good business school. But during that time too, I was just obsessed with beginning to be obsessed with writing. And I wrote a story about this little creek up in Pennsylvania, like a 3,000 word tome, like put everything into it. And I had sent it off to many magazines, but one of them wrote me back just right around the time that I got my acceptance into business school and said, "We'd love to publish your piece. We'd love to pay you $200, for 3,000 words." And I was like, "Shit, yeah, dude." Literally from that moment, it was not probably the smartest financial decision. I remember I wasn't married at the time, but I was dating my wife. And I remember her dad being like, but it was the best decision besides getting married and having children, it was the best decision I've ever made. I mean, it was it's just really what I wanted to do. And then, I got a job, my first job in journalism, and I put quotes around that because I was hired as a secretary, basically. They didn't call it that. They called it editorial assistant. But as a secretary in Sports Afield, which is the reason I had to move to New York in the first place. But I literally answered phones and hello, Sports Afield, and I'd direct the call or, deal with some angry subscriber whose magazine had shown up all crumpled up or whatever. But, during that time too, I was just hungry as hell. I would just go up to editors, and be like, is there a 200-word story where I can write 150-word stories? Anything I can do to help on this side like that? And it happened to be a lot of young, kind of an infusion of youngish editors there who had all gone to journalism school. So, that really helped. And then, during that time too, my soon-to-be wife was still in Washington, D.C. I was in New York, kind of, living with some other dudes, but pretty much by myself, with my dog. And I would, work all day, come home, walk the dog or whatever, have dinner, but then, write for 2 to 3 hours every night. Mm-hmm. Didn't write great. I mean, some of it was, was trying to write short stories or whatever, but I just that's where actually I did most, I did a lot of writing in college and high school as well, but really it's when you find your focus and you're like, this is really what I want to do. And you put everything into it is when you learn the most. I feel like that's when I learned the most. I kind of made my own master's program, so to speak. And I kind of miss those days. I mean, they were hardcore, right? But I don't obviously have time to do that anymore, but it was a great, it was a great way to learn, I thought, and I read everything too. And I reread things when I read The Blind Side by Michael Lewis, which I think is just a really well put together book, especially with and it has one of the best sort of opening leads of any book any nonfiction book I've ever read. So I would read the book for pleasure first, and then I go back and read it again a couple weeks later and look for the bones, try to see how it's put together. And some of those books I've read now, not as much as the McGuane stories, but I've read probably The Blind Side 4 times now, I'd say. I mean, so sort of I guess I taught myself a little bit, but it's just being scrappy and just trying to just write for anything and for any amount of money. And, when I came up through journalism, the internet had not subsumed the whole thing then either. It was kind of a pain. It was hard to get a story in a magazine. Like, it was like you really, and it was celebrated. I remember when one of my first cover stories was on Nick Saban, actually, for Forbes, and it was like this big deal, man. Like, people would come by in the office and be like, "Hey, great job, man, way to go!" Like, it was like this. It was like you had done something monumental. Nowadays, who gives a crap? But it was like it was cool back then. But so it was like a rungs of the ladder you had to kind of climb up and fight your way up.
Again, I think it goes back to that obsession thing. You were just completely obsessed with it. And was there ever a point where you were like, man, this is just too hard. I don't want to, I'm going to go get a normal job somewhere. Or was it always just, I refuse to quit. I'm going to do this.
In the end, I refused to quit. Right. But there's never been a time when I've seriously considered doing anything else. Never. There are times when you daydream being like, man, is there something easier you could do? Because it doesn't get any. It never gets any easier. That's the crazy thing about this. It sounds crazy. It sounds horrible, and when you say it that way. When I say it that way, people are like, "Ooh, that sounds terrible." Because most jobs do get a little bit easier, but to me, that's the coolest part of the whole deal, right? You're inventing something every time you sit down to with that cursor blinking at you. Obviously with nonfiction, I don't mean like you're inventing this stuff, but you're inventing a narrative, right?
Yeah.
You're inventing a way to tell something. It is new. No one is going to tell the story like you're going to tell it now, unless you're like Jason Blair, some kind of plagiarist. But, so the fact that it's just as hard, as much of a pain in the ass as that is, and as much as it scares me. Every time I get a book deal, one part of me is like, yay. And the other part of me is like, God damn, what am I doing to myself? It's like, it just takes an enormous amount of energy to kind of come up to just do it all. But that's what's cool about it. That otherwise you don't, you never want to get to a point in your career, no matter what you do, that you're just mailing it in, right? You want to be challenged. And as much as that, as you get a little older, I think I don't know, it feels more daunting in a weird way. Like like, I don't want to be challenged now. I should be thinking about retirement. I'm not that old yet, but you just like, you don't have the juice you had in your 20s or whatever, but that's all part of the fun. Like that fear when you get, I just turned in a new book proposal, and I'm enjoying this. Like, I know no one's probably going to get back to me till the new year, and I'm kind of enjoying, kind of hiding right now, and not having the pressure of someone buying it and saying, yeah, go ahead. Like, oh my God, dude, now I got 2 years, whatever, a year or 2 years or however long it's going to take you to do this thing. So I don't know. The challenge is it's what it's all about.
Oh yeah. No, I think if anything, it's two different subjects, but like any sort of like physical challenges I've done, every time before I start, I have this just dread and almost like a fear, and like I coming up with a bunch of excuses. And if the only thing that's made it a little bit easier is that now I'm ready for that. And when it shows up, I'm like, all right, well, there it is. And it still makes me, I feel like I'm like start crying or something because I don't want to do it, but I'm used to that arising and I can deal with it. But it's always there, and it just makes me feel kind of crazy. But I think that's good, man. That's what you want. You don't want to be just sitting around and comfortable and all that. That's not good. I don't think.
It's not good. You get all soggy. Your brain gets all soggy. And spend too much time on the internet, and I don't know. I love it when I'm really busy on something that I really love. I feel like I'm at my best as a person.
What is your routine like for writing? I would imagine it's different with writing articles versus books. But do you have a certain time of day that you like to write, or do you have a certain routine when you're staring at that blinking cursor and like, all right, here we go? How do you get it going?
I'm very much a man of routine. So once I figure out what's working, and the routine can shift with different books. But once I kind of figure out what's working, I try to kind of stick with that. But with books, I always report it first. I don't write much. I'll write little, if something pops in my head, I'll write down little phrases and stuff like that too. But I always try to report the living hell out of the thing before I actually sit down and write it, because there's so many things that pop up and surprise you, and so many connections that you can make through the reporting. And I've always I've thought about reporting as being like, okay, I've got this like big box, and every little nugget that I get from somebody is like a puzzle piece. And I throw them all into the box. And it's hard unless you're super disciplined. I know there are some great reporters out there who do this better than I do, but to keep that all kind of systematic and itemized. Like I feel like reporting these days, you just have to grab what you grab. So you throw it all into this big box. Once you start hearing the same stories over and over again, you're like, okay, that's when usually I think to myself anyway, like, okay, I think it's time to start writing. And the writing basically is you shake that big box full of puzzle pieces, you chuck them on the floor.
Yep.
Unless you're really good at, doing better outlines, stuff like that than I am. And then you just have to figure out how they all fit together. I mean, there's some obvious things that fit together, but that's, that's about figuring out the narrative, figuring out the structure, all that kind of stuff too. So, my process is, I mean, ideally what I would do is I love the mornings, a good quiet morning, with a strong cup of coffee and, sitting in my chair. It's just fun. Like, I like being there. And then, you just write. I don't know. The best days to me are the ones when you're just really into it and you're writing, and all of a sudden, it's 2:00 and you're like, shit, dude, I didn't eat lunch yet. Like you're that into it. It's pretty awesome. I do think it's really important at some point during the day. I mean, this obviously, if you have a tight deadline, you got to like crank it out, that you just do it. But I think it's always good. I always try to leave like an hour. Let's say I work till 6, right? Like I'll kind of just stop writing at 5, and I'll just, at that point, maybe read over some stuff, but just kind of relax. Hemingway always he always stopped right in the middle of when he was really hot and he was really writing really well, he would always stop in the middle because he felt like that it would carry over to the next day. Yeah. I don't know about that, but I do think it's important to sort of stop and reread a little bit at night. And then I'll sometimes reread just a tad, in the morning, just to kind of get into the flow again, get back into the voice a little bit. But, it's such an odd, I never knew this, but I mean, I should have known it, but like being a reporter, journalist, like it's such an odd mixture between being an extrovert, which is when you have to go out and report, and, you have to smile and you have to get people to tell you things, some things they don't necessarily, always want to be so forthcoming about. But you have to become this extreme extrovert who's just, pulling stories out and being very social and all this kind of stuff too. And then you've got the other flip side, which is the complete introversion of the writing process, when you just get so deep down into that rabbit hole that, you grow a beard and you kind of look a little funny or whatever, but you're so into it, and you purposely keep out a lot of the distraction because you don't want other things in your head.
Yeah.
So it's actually kind of fun, right? I mean, I'm more naturally a little more introverted, so that introversion comes a lot easier to me than I really have to kind of, gird my loins for a strong reporting trip. Like that doesn't come naturally to me. It's something I kind of got to work on, but it takes a little more work. I'll put it that way.
What are some of the techniques that you've developed to get some of these people to open up? Because I mean, I feel like Saban, good guy. I mean, I would be scared just to even like shake that guy's hand, much less ask him some probing question. But then these, fishermen, I think are generally, or at least a subset of them, are pretty quiet, kind of suspicious, don't want anybody to know about their spots, don't want anybody to know about them. And so how do you get these guys to open up, especially the tough crowd that you've made a career of telling their stories?
I think everybody is a little bit different, but I think, every interviewee is a little bit different. But I think the first thing you do is just show a lot of respect by learning as much as you can about them, right? No matter who it is, just try to learn a lot about them so that you look like you're vested in what they're going to say. And then, to me, I forgot who told me this, but somebody along the way told me that, ask a question and then be quiet. And not only just be quiet and let them talk, but listen, like really, really, really listen to what they're saying. And it is, that to me takes a little bit of work. Actually, it takes a little bit of work to actually really listen to what people are saying. It also takes a lot of work not to talk. you kind of want to like be in a conversation or whatever. But if you if you ask someone a question, and then just are quiet, when they seem like they finish their question like that, this is an old reporter trick, but if you just stay quiet,
mm-hmm.
they'll keep talking. It's a natural thing to want to fill sort of, quiet space. So, I mean, that doesn't always work, but I think that's a good thing kind of to keep in mind anyway, even in conversations with other people, as long as it's not awkward. As long as not after every sentence you're quiet waiting for someone to talk. But I don't know, to me, it's really hard, especially this day and age, man, where it's like social media and your phone and text distractions and beeping and bopping and stuff like that. It's hard to really listen sometimes. It's like really hard. But if you really listen, then I think, people know that you're really listening, and they I don't know. And people want to talk. Like I'm with the Saban book, I remember, people were like, well, Belichick's not going to talk to you, and these people aren't going to talk to you. They're not going to talk to you. And I was like, maybe not. But I called them up, or I went and met them, and 98% of them did.
Yeah,
and wanted to talk. And I think that's just a natural human impulse too. Like you want to tell people stories.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think people love to talk about themselves. I mean, I think as long as they know that you're going to give it a fair representation of what they said, I think people love talking about themselves.
Yeah.
Who do you admire you've mentioned McGuane, but who do you admire both in the journalism world and other writers, maybe that you haven't mentioned so far?
I mean, McPhee to me, John McPhee.
Yeah.
Just freaking awesome. I mean, I haven't read all of his books, but I've read a good number of them, and I've read a lot of his stories, and maybe more important than that, he's got 2 books out about writing, which to me are, he teaches at Princeton, so it's almost like being in that class. And like, I don't know, McPhee is just always been so awesome, I feel like, and a great person to sort of emulate if you can. I mean, Michael Lewis, I've mentioned before. I love Ian Fraser. I've always loved Ian Fraser.
Mm-hmm.
I love his wit. So that's, on the nonfiction side. On the fiction side, I've actually, there's so many. They're hard to, I wouldn't want to take up all the time mentioning them all, but I've been on an Emily St. John Mandel kick. I read Station 11 and The Glass Hotel. I love really, really good, rich novels. I just love them. I think it's really good for nonfiction writers to read novels, just for narrative and how to put sentences together and all that sort of stuff. And conversely, I think it's really good for novelists to read nonfiction as well, because there's a lot of facts in novels too, even though a lot of things are made up. But James Salter's probably my favorite novelist of all time, or has written my favorite book. So I don't know. I really read as voraciously as possible. One of my least favorite states to be in is when I'm just finished a book and I don't have another one, ready, and I have to go. I don't mind. I mean, I love going to bookstores, but it makes me feel uncomfortable when I reach over on the nightstand and I'm like, damn, I'm done.
Do you go through one at a time, or do you have several going at once?
One at a time.
I wish I could do that. I can't do it, man. I've always got like 3 going.
That's what my mom reads, like 4 at a time or something. Like, how do you? I guess it's like watching TV shows, right? I mean, I can do that or I used to when we didn't watch network TV. Like, I could watch the Cosby Show and what Different Strokes and whatever, right? Or even serials. You could kind of like, you can watch Game of Thrones and you can watch some other thing and kind of. So I understand how you guys can do it, but I don't know. I like to devote my full attention to one. I get really into, especially if it's a great book. Like it's, like I can't wait to go to bed so I can read it.
Yeah,
really into it.
That's cool. Well, man, I can't believe it, but we're bumping up on an hour, which is amazing. I feel like we just started. I've got a few quick questions that I like to run through with everybody, because it's kind of cool to compare the answers. Can we go through a few of those real quick?
Sure, absolutely.
So you've written extensively, or there are a lot of really cool articles that I came across, but that are related to the West. Like I was hoping we'd have time to talk about it. Maybe you can come back on and we'll talk about it, about like your profile of Louis Bacon, the hedge fund conservationist. And then there was a great profile you did, or a story you did about elk hunting and bird hunting at the High Lonesome Ranch. So you've obviously, spent a lot of time out this way. Are there any books that come to mind that are your favorite about the American West?
I'm a big Stegner fan. I loved Angle of Repose.
Yeah.
If you want to go into like one that's a little more recent, Sisters, Brothers, I've read it twice. Have you read that book?
No, I've never read that one.
Oh, dude, you got to read that book. Patrick DeWitt. It's called The Sisters, Brothers. And it is just awesome. It is just like sort of in a True Grit way, like a little bit of like sort of satirizing some of the old Western things, but it is so freaking funny.
Perfect. I'll have links to those in the episode notes. And I don't think anybody's ever even mentioned that one. So I'll definitely check that one out. Thanks.
Awesome.
What's your favorite book of all time? If you had to pick one, I know that's a hard question.
Yeah, I know it's a hard question. I mean, I would always say Gatsby. And I used to read Gatsby every spring, and I would always read it in one sitting because it's a book you can actually read in one sitting, which is always fascinating to me. And I always find something new in it. But I have to say, just as of late, I don't know if you've read any James Salter, but he's got a book called Light Years, which is actually one of Richard Ford's. I heard Richard Ford talking about it on a radio program when I was in New Orleans, 10 years ago. And he was talking about sort of this undiscovered underappreciated classic. And it literally is, it's heartbreaking, beautifully written. So Light Years by James Salter, I would say is my favorite book.
Again, that's a new one. I don't think anybody's mentioned that. So I'll have links to all this stuff. Thank you. Those are great. I don't know if you have time or if you make time to watch movies or documentaries or anything like that, but do any come to mind that have been influential? And they don't have to be about the West. It can be about anything.
Yeah. My wife is in that business. She's a documentary, producer. So yeah, we do watch a decent amount of documentaries. I love the Michael Jordan one. I know you said you just watched that.
So good.
But it's so funny when people ask what my favorite movie is. Like, I'm always very honest. It's Trading Places.
Nice. That's a good one.
It's Eddie Murphy at his apex of his funniness. Like, how does it? I don't know. The movie's a classic. It's also a Christmas movie, which people forget. But no, I just love. Eddie Murphy cracked me up more than anyone in the world, and I just think that movie is awesome.
No, that's a good one. Eddie Murphy in his prime. I don't think there's anything funnier than that. So one more question about the West. In your travels out this way, is there one spot, and you don't have to give away any secrets, but is there one spot that sticks out as your favorite?
So I lived out West for, 4 summers. I lived in Ketchum.
Nice. I love that place.
I know. It's so cool. And I worked as a deli boy. And I basically just, it was an excuse to be out there. I think my job, I worked from 3 to 9 every day. So I was like, I could mountain bike and fish and on both, morning and the evening. But so I love Ketchum, always will love Ketchum. But to me, the quintessential Western spot is, when you're walking around the ranch portion of the Henry's Fork, and you get that burnt sage smell. You got those beautiful mountains surrounding you. You've got, a gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous river going through that valley, and really hard to catch, but enormous rainbow trout. To me, that is the West.
Yeah, you can't beat that. I've driven all over this place, and that specific spot where you're talking about always kind of comes to mind as one of just the most stunning places. You're like, all right, this is wild. So last question, knowing everything about, your time in the West, your extensive reading and your writing and just all these interesting things you bring to the table, and you've created this professional and personal life around. Do you have any advice for people who listen to this podcast? And, most people who listen to this are obsessed with the West in one way or another. But do you have any kind of words of wisdom, anything you'd like to share to wrap it up?
If anyone's an aspiring writer out there, I've got one little nugget from John McPhee that I love, that was in one of his books, his writing books, we're always looking for different ways to say things. So we're always like, a lot of us I've got a great thesaurus, which I used extensively, but he always says when he's looking for another way to describe or another word to use, he'll look up the definition of the word instead. That's come in very handy. In a bigger sense, to me, one of the great pleasures and privileges of this job, which is interviewing a bunch of different people who are really interesting and have different philosophies in life, is like kind of immersing yourself in in learning about these people and what they do. And Saban, obviously, Nick Saban was had maybe more impact than a lot of other people I've written about. But I think his whole thing about process thinking, which is essentially sort of like the AA steps, right? But it's about we talked earlier about when you have whether you want to go on a 100-mile run or you have to write a book, like it's daunting when you think about it.
Yeah.
But if you take, as Saban preaches and does very well, if you just take everything, on a minute-to-minute, hour-to-hour, day-to-day basis, break it all down. Don't think about the bigger picture, but just break everything down in little nuggets that you can accomplish every day. And I think this works for anything in life. It's not just writing. It's not just running. It just works in anything. Then I think that just makes it makes it palatable and makes it doable, and B, I think it makes it more fun.
Yeah, process is everything, and that was one of the big takeaways I took from your book on Saban. I mean, that really drilled that home, and it's a real world example. And I think that's wonderful advice. Well, man, I absolutely love the book. I love everything you write. I'm so glad I got connected with you, and I look forward to all your books in the future, and open invite to come on here and talk about any of it at any time. And I really appreciate everything you're doing. My life has been seriously enriched by your work, so I appreciate it.
Man, that's so nice to you. Keep up the great work. This podcast is amazing. I'm so glad that Rick at Howler Brothers was, he kind of turned me on to it. I don't know, it's been like 6 months. I've listened to a bunch of them now. You're doing a great job. So keep it up, dude. This stuff is great. It's very important.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast, and thanks for listening to that particular episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Before you go, I've got 3 quick things. Number 1, if you like the podcast, please do me a huge favor. Either pass it along to a friend who may be interested, share it on your social media, or go to iTunes and give it a 5-star review. All those things would mean a lot to me, and they would really help to spread the word about the podcast. Number 2, if you've listened to many of these episodes, you know that I love reading and I love talking about books. Every other month, I send out a quick email with a few books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The subjects are varied, but they're pretty much all nonfiction with an emphasis on history, biographies, adventure narratives, and topics related to the American West. There are no sales pitches for ranches, no spam, no other kind of nonsense, just books. So if you'd like to sign up for the list, head to Mountain and Prairie/reading, or just go to Mountain and Prairie and there's a massive tab at the top that says book recommendations. Click on it. There are a ton of good books that I've read. Some of the old email lists are on there. You can go crazy. There are a lot of books. And finally, if you know anyone I should interview for the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. All my contact info is at mountainandprairie.com, and I'm on all the social media stuff, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, blah, blah, blah. So feel free to reach out. I'd love to have some recommendations and suggestions of interesting people I should meet. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.